Everybody, today is our first day of Unit 7, and we are going to be talking about progressivism. And this will be our first day talking about progressivism. So, if you remember, we kind of left off in Unit 6. We talked about how the growth of industry in America, we talked about laissez-faire, where the government kind of stayed out of things. With this unit, and with the progressive movement, you are going to see that government is no longer going to sit on the wayside, but government is going to become very involved in what is happening within the country. This is going to be in response to a lot of people seeing and looking at the system, looking at pictures like this of these homeless kids within New York City and saying, you know, this system has brought a lot of wealth to our country, but also there's a lot of inequalities and there's a lot of mistreatment of workers as part of this. And you're going to see this groundswell and push for change during this time. So when you think about the progressive era, you nearly think about government intervention because government is going to be very, very much a part of this. Even today, when you think about people that call themselves progressives, generally they are in favor of more government intervention in a variety of different ways. So you can see there the quote from Woodrow Wilson, one of the well-known progressives during this time. He says, I am a progressive because we have not kept up with our own changes of conditions, either in the economic field or in the political field. We have not kept up as well as other nations have. We have not adjusted our practices to the facts of the case. So there is a John Green video here if you want to check out and watch. I froze it on a great part for you to see, or screenshotted a great part. His face there. So what would be the causes of the progressive movement? One, economic exploitation. You're going to see the formation of trusts and monopolies. While trusts and monopolies in and of themselves are not inherently evil, they can be used for very evil purposes if they want to. We talked about guys like John Rockefeller, who he believed about having a monopoly that he was doing the Lord's work and that he was bringing chaos to an industry that had a lot of confusion. And he saw it too as he was helping consumers because he was able to lower prices in a lot of ways. But then you have other people who didn't look at the role of their monopoly or trust in the same way and didn't use it to mutually benefit society, you could say. Exploitation of natural resources. Some people looked at what was happening to the environment and were not happy with that and want to change in that. Two, political corruption. Again, I mentioned in the last unit, laissez-faire, government staying out of things, and there was a lot of big business interest working at play in the government during that time. People did not like that. People also didn't like political machines and how political machines were maintaining power through voter intimidation and things that they were doing. So people didn't like the political corruption that they were seeing. Also, social injustice. People looked at child labor. We talked about how many children under the age of 16 were working during this time, and people weren't happy with that. Poor living conditions. Again, you go into the cities where a lot of people lived in squalor and tenement apartments. Consumer protection. You're going to see during this time, you're going to have some very important books that come out that describe the meatpacking industry and other industries. And people started believing that, you know, something needed to happen to help protect the consumers in this country. And then you also have racial, gender, and ethnic equality that would be pushed for during this time as well. And we're going to see that in a variety of different ways that we'll get into during this time. So what were the goals of the progressive movement? One, to increase economic opportunity for everyone. Two, increase democracy within our country. And then, of course, increasing social justice as well. So progressivism. So even though we talk about progressivism and we talk about this big idea of progressivism, you're going to see that progressivism was a movement, but it was not a highly organized movement. And basically, you're not going to see there was like an agreed upon agenda or unifying organization. And that's why we talked about in the last slide, the goals of the progressives, they are very vague because it really depended on who you asked as far as a progressive. Both the GOP and the Democrats would have progressive wings. And you're going to see the movement would be made up of a lot of different groups. Overall, their goal was to use the government in order to make a better society. But again, it largely depended upon who you talk to. A black progressive is going to have a very different idea of what progressivism meant to them than maybe a white factory worker in a city. Progressivism, again, while it is a movement, it is not unified in any sense. So who are the progressives? Again, you're going to see, like I said, progressives are going to be all over the place. It was a very diverse group. Again, often having very different goals. Some of the leaders of it, you see Protestant church leaders, African Americans, union leaders, and women. Most progressives would be middle-class men and women who lived in cities. But again, progressivism is going to be all over the chart based on who you talk to. So why progressivism? Again, I mentioned this in the beginning. People looked at the effects of industrialization, and they didn't really like what was happening as a result of industrialization. You can say, going back, remember we talked about Thomas Jefferson and how he went over to Europe, and he didn't like what he saw in cities as a result of factories. Basically, that had happened here, and people didn't like it either. Slums, you'll see reformers such as we've mentioned, Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. They would establish a Hull House in Chicago in response to that. People look at the poverty in the working class and say, hey, people are working 16 hours a day and are still in poverty. Child labor. We mentioned that. Labor issues. We talked about how the government constantly sided with management in these battles over between workers and management. And so people didn't like that. Women's rights. And also you'd see the Christian response to this, which would be the social gospel. So you'd also have intellectualism being part of this as well. This was a movement led in a lot of ways by intellectuals during that time. You'd have the idea of scientific investigation. So you're going to see during this time a lot of studies by the federal government on important issues and using statistics to drive policy. Also, scientific management is going to be a part of it. We mentioned that and how a lot of workers did not like that. But also, you're going to see scientific management applied in other areas as well, again, to try to make things more efficient, such as government and schools and hospitals. How can we make things efficient and cheaper? And then you're going to have the transatlantic exchange ideas between Germany and the United States during this time, which will bring some ideas from Germany. We already kind of mentioned Karl Marx and the idea of socialism being brought in as well. But you'll see those transatlantic ideas affecting things as well. You'd also have the idea of pragmatism, which is ideas being judged by consequences rather than an absolute truth. William James and John Dewey would push this new philosophy, and this allowed progressives to really challenge the fixed notions that stood in the way of reform. The whole idea behind this is you need to experiment with different ideas and laws and find something that works and then go with that. So with this, it's kind of like, we're going to throw a bunch of things out there, see what works, get rid of the things that don't work and stick with the things that work. I love this picture of the monkey with the gun. Pragmatism, no matter how trustworthy he may appear, do not give the monkey your pistol. And again, kind of represents pragmatism, this idea of you can try an idea once, but if the monkey shoots you once, you don't try that idea again. And that's what pragmatism was in regards to progressivism. Now, one of the big groups that you're going to have that is going to make a big impact during this time would be the muckrakers. Editors started to realize that what really interested middle-class reformers and readers was the exposure of corruption and mischief within American life. This term would actually be coined by Teddy Roosevelt, who read a lot of these muckraking novels. The term muckraker, I don't know how many of you have ever worked in horses, but if you have to or with animals where you have to muck a stall. Muck a stall is basically where you clean out the stall, and you can imagine what's in an animal's stall. And that's the idea of these reformers are getting down in the muck and the mire and the nasty stuff to expose bad things within society. Some of the most famous ones, you'd have Ida Tarbell, who would attack Standard Oil, David Graham Phillips, the effect of money in the Senate, William Hard, who would expose child labor and industrial accidents, and then probably the most famous of them, Upton Sinclair, who writes The Jungle. And you can see there, again, here's some more famous ones. Mention Ida Tarbell, who brings a lot of attention to Standard Oil and some of their monopolistic practices. Lincoln Steffens, who writes Shame of Cities, again, focusing on how bad conditions were in the city. Upton Sinclair with The Jungle, which really was meant to focus on working conditions, but more people focused on how nasty the meat packing industry was in our country. And then Jacob Riss, who wrote How the Other Half Lives, which wasn't really a book. It showed a bunch of pictures. And actually the first picture that I showed you today of the children, homeless children in New York City, that was a Jacob Riss picture. And he traveled around the country showing people these pictures and helping bring awareness to how things actually were. So you're going to see that after 1910, you would see a decline in muckraking. They started to decline because people, it was difficult to top one another as far as sensationalistic stories. Publishers started getting economic pressure from bank and advertisers to tone down their treatment of businesses because it affected them financially. And corporations started to become more aware of their image and started creating public relations departments, which pretty much every company has this day. But you see that muckraking does serve a very important purpose in the early progressive movement in the early 20th century. As I said, you're going to see progressives from all over the scale, different types of progressives. Female progressives, again, women during this time would largely keep with the idea of social housekeepers by attacking social issues such as prostitution, poverty, temperance as well. Josephine Shaw Lowell, she would establish the New York Consumers League to help improve working conditions and wages of female clerks. Florence Kelley would take over this league and turn its focus to protective legislation for women and children. So these women reformers, this is the kind of thing that they were pushing for. You would see Mueller versus Oregon, which went through the Supreme Court in 1908. This upheld Oregon's 10-hour workday for women. But the court did look at the effect of long working hours on women and families rather than focusing purely on constitutional laws. What had happened with this is actually businesses had brought this because they didn't like the idea of only a 10-hour workday for women. And the Supreme Court said Oregon can do that. This would open the idea and the door for approval of a lot of different more social welfare type laws within the states. And this would be a victory for women. I see in 1911, Illinois would provide public assistance to women with dependent children. And then in 1912, you start to have more child labor laws developed at the state and local level. So with this, you're going to see the social welfare state had arrived in the U.S. through a maternalistic system, again, looking at it through the eyes of women, and again, first providing for women with children. With this, you're also going to see the women's suffrage movement would be part of this. Women like Jane Addams and Kelly, who we talked about, started to ask, why should a woman who's capable of running a settlement house and doing everything else? Remember, we talked way back to the Second Great Awakening that women started to take the leadership in these. So they started saying, like, if we can lead in these areas, then why don't we have the right to vote? Why can't we participate in the political system? And why should only women like themselves be making the fight? Shouldn't we be incorporating more? Shouldn't men be part of this as well? And shouldn't working class women be part of this? So you're going to start to see them join the suffrage movement. You'd also have the National Women's Trade Union, which would be founded by wealthy supporters of women's suffrage in New York. And they would actually organize women's workers, women's strikes, and train working class leaders as well. So you're going to see things are accelerating very, very quickly for women. In 1910, you'll see women's suffrage activity begins to increase greatly in Britain. And again, this is not just the United States. You actually see this throughout the world. In Britain, suffragists had picketed Parliament, assaulted politicians, and staged hunger strikes while in jail. And you're going to start to see, as far as our country go, the way that you start to see women's suffrage happening is in the Western states. And you might be wondering, why is it happening in the Western states? Is it just because they're so much more liberal and advanced and progressive than the rest of the country? No, in some ways it had selfish purposes because you're going to see at this point that a lot of Western states did not meet the population threshold to become part of the country. And that population threshold was based on the number of voters. And so as a way of getting that population threshold, if women were given the right to vote, they would be included as part of that voters number, and Western states become states faster. So you're going to see that's why it starts in the West. Leaders such as Alice Paul, in the women's movement, they begin to push for an amendment to give all women the right to vote. And you'll see there's other organizations as well that would push for this. And again, as I mentioned, women getting the right to vote starting out in Western states. And that is what this political cartoon here, which is a popular one to be shown, it shows that kind of the West leading the way for women in the rest of the country who are crying for the way for the ability to be able to vote. You'd also see during this time the emergence of feminism. Younger college-educated and self-supported women began to meet together and call themselves feminists. And basically what that meant was freedom for personal development during this time. Of course, feminists pushed for suffrage because they said, hey, we're equal to men in every way, and so that we should be able to vote like that. So again, the effect of this on the whole women's movement, again, pushing more for that, idea of women being equal to men. And again, that's, of course, is pervasive in our society today. It'd be hard to find somebody that say, women aren't equal to men today. But again, during this time, that was not a widely accepted idea. Also, urban liberalism. So you'll see, again, liberalism, progressivism within the cities. Working people would join in several different ways. And again, applying to women, you're going to have the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which happens in New York City, where you're going to have 146 women who die. It had been in the shirtwaist factory. A fire got started because there weren't effective ways for people to get out. Basically, there was only one exit to the building, and that led to the death of these 146 women, some of them suffocating to death, some of them deciding that they would rather jump out of windows. This not only led to reform in that, but also led to reform in building safety as well, and making it easier for people to get out in the case of a fire. As you can see there, in response to that, New York Safety Commission or New York Factory Commission would pass 56 laws dealing with workplace safety. And Tammany Hall politicians would be the leaders of this commission, even though you're going to see that they're going to start to wane in their strength. Again, we talked about people didn't like political corruption. So as a result, you're going to see urban liberalism born, who advocated active intervention by the state to lift the laboring masses in the cities. So again, we have women. Now we have urban workers joining together to try to push for, safer workplaces and eventually other workplace laws as well. Now, talking about progressives, you're going to see how does temperance and prohibition apply to this? You're going to see oftentimes people that called themselves progressives were kind of torn and divided over the issue of temperance and prohibition. Our urban progressives generally did not favor temperance. And that is despite the fact that you're going to see a lot of times saloons were the headquarters of political machines, but still a lot of times urban progressives did not appreciate it. Whereas rural progressives favored it because they felt like that it would help clean up society. It would clean up morals and politics in one stroke by taking out the influence of alcohol. And we talked about before, a lot of the reason why people pushed for prohibition, a lot of women pushed for prohibition, is they felt like that men were getting drunk and it was detrimental to the family. The Dries, as they were known, who were prohibitionists, were well organized, and by 1915 they had persuaded 2/3 of state legislatures to prohibit alcohol sales. So you can see how we eventually get to that point of passing an amendment to ban the sale of alcohol here in the country. The Socialist Party, as I had said earlier, with the import of ideas in from Europe, you'll see that the Socialist Party starts to grow in cities, challenging the power of the political machines. In 1910, Milwaukee would elect Victor Berger as the first socialist congressman. And in 1912, the socialist Eugene V. Debs, who we talked about him before, leading the American Railway Union, he would earn 6% of the popular vote within a presidential election, which would be a lot for a socialist to earn that. With this, you will see that sometimes as part of the progressive movement, you have nativism being part of that. A lot of time anti-immigrant policies were disguised as progressive reform during this time, including something like prohibition. The National Anti-Saloon League began to advocate for prohibition in many states. A lot of times people looked at immigrants coming in, Irish immigrants, Germans, the Southern and Eastern immigrants coming in. And that was one of the ways they attacked them, was by going after alcohol, because a lot of times people viewed these immigrants as being a bunch of alcoholics. And you're going to see a new goal, again, would be to restrict immigrants coming into the country, which would challenge our traditional open door policy. But we talked about how that was already happening in the late 19th century as well. Often urban liberals would oppose these. But again, this is another example of how you're going to kind of see that progressives are torn in what their goals and what they want to do. So again, remember, progressivism, a big movement, has a lot of different parts to it. Organized labor. They would be a part of this as well. You'd have labor unions pushing to join the progressive fight for workplace legislation. Industrial accidents, again, were a huge issue during this time, and this is something that people really wanted to pass legislation to confront. As you can see there in the coal industry, you'd have 2,000 coal miners a year being killed on the jobs. And with this, you start to see a lot of the industrial states from 1910 to 17 start to enact insurance laws covering on-the-job accidents. And again, this was very important because if you think about if you're working in a factory and you get injured, let's say your arm gets cut off, before these laws are passed, it's like, well, you can't do your job anymore. You're fired. Today, we have laws in place as a result of this era right here, like workers' compensation and disability, where if you get injured like that on a job, you will be given financial compensation for that. Also, you'll see that health insurance and unemployment insurance were not very popular in the U.S. Eventually, they would become, but at this time, they were not. Political reforms as well. Again, talking about how these progressive reformers often did not like corruption and pushed to fight against that. Robert M. La Follette, a very famous progressive, his Wisconsin idea, he looked at corruption, was very upset about the corruption, and he said, let's go back to the first principles of democracy, go back to the people. So through his ideas, he's able to win the governorship of Wisconsin. He would eventually go on and serve in Congress, but his platform was for high corporate taxes, strict railroad and utility regulations, and political reform as well. Now, you are going to see with this, some big political changes during this time, one being the direct primary, which allowed voters to pick their party candidates rather than party conventions. So we went through this earlier this year in 2020, going through the primary to pick who the Democratic candidate would be to run for president. This started during this era. Before that, a convention decided, but now you get a primary is where the people get to decide. The direct election of senators with the 17th Amendment, I think we've mentioned that one before, where now people voted on the senators versus state legislatures. The initiative, this is where citizens could place their issues on the ballot. So if there's something you care enough about, you can usually create a petition, get enough signatures, and that issue can be put on the ballot. Referendum, citizens get to vote on a proposed measure. So this is where the government comes up, has an idea for a law or maybe a change to a state constitution. That goes to a referendum to the people, and they get to decide. Again, I think I've said before, but the referendum, you really see that today used a lot in places like California. The recall, removal of office holders through special elections. And this, again, would be where you get a politician in place you don't feel like they're representing the interests of the people. You can actually recall them and force them to run again for office. Recall most recently has been used in Wisconsin several times. It's never been successful in removing the office holder there, but it has been used there. Now, when I talk about these, I always have students bring up and say, well, what if we have a president we don't like? Can we recall them? No. And know that initiative, referendum, and recall, these are state initiatives and state policy changes that are going to be happening. And again, it largely depends on the state that you're in. So for example, Virginia doesn't have any way to recall like a governor that we might not like. Despite these changes, you're going to see political power is still influenced by well-financed interests. Again, that's just part of our system. Actually, that's part of politics pretty much wherever you go in the world, that if you have a lot of money, you can influence the system. So finishing out here, you're going to do a bumper sticker. I'll let you read about that. But just know, like I said, progressivism, again, isn't one solidified, solid movement. Just think about progressivism, and you got a lot of stuff going on under it, a lot of people with different goals and what they thought it looked like. So today we saw, some wanted political changes, some wanted labor changes, some wanted women's rights changes, some wanted to ban alcohol. So really, it just depended on who you were talking to. So remember that. I know when I'm talking through this today, it seems like, I'm jumping all over the place, and that's really how the progressive movement is. It kind of is all over the place. Now, we will get some more solid ideas once you start to get some progressive politicians coming in, which we're going to talk about next class, like a Teddy Roosevelt and a Woodrow Wilson. So hope you have a great day, and hope you have a little bit of understanding of progressivism and how they wanted to use the government to bring social change.